Pixie is one of the most underrated reload players at the moment going into EWC, and he just got 2 wins in the most recent Solo Reload Victory Cup, so let's break down his gameplay. Pixie's drop spot of choice is Chisel Cubes, which is unsurprising as this is where he lands in duos, with his duo Swizzy. After quickly looting up, Pixie looks to push a player, but unable to find any quick opening damage, he ends up deciding to disengage from this fight. One important detail is that Pixie seems to like the Iron Pump more than the other 2 shotguns, as he decides not to take both a Morphi Pump and a Sentinel Pump. Now though, Pixie finds another player to fight, and the way he approaches this is really interesting. While most players would probably try to fight straight on, Pixie makes sure to put himself at a height advantage so that he has a good angle on the opponent. Since he landed in the water, it could have been really awkward if he didn't go up right away. Though, seeing as the opponent is backing up and trying to make space, Pixie shows extreme map knowledge and loops around to the back, which catches the opponent off guard. This allows him to hit a quick 150 tag, and he uses his kill switch revolvers to finish the kill. Next, Pixie decides to fight the other person who was at Chiseled Cubes, who he quickly manages to dispatch, making a right hand peek, full piecing the opponent, and finishing him off. Pixie shows great fundamentals here, making sure that he doesn't push off of a left hand peek, and making a right hand peek instead. Noticing that the opponent doesn't have their cone or their walls, he's quickly able to finish them, but he maintains his composure, staying on his right hand peek until his pump reloads. In this next fight though, Pixie ends up going down, and this is mainly because he makes a bad peek trying to look from below. If Pixie had just boxed up or just played more backwards, then he might have been able to put a wall in between them, but he ends up going down anyways. Upon respawning, he is instantly keyed, and he just simply doesn't have the resources to win this fight, so he ends up going down for a second time, leaving him with only 1 life remaining. Again, he's shot to low HP out of the air, and he's cut down to nearly 10 HP, but he manages to hide and escape from the players who were trying to chase him down. From there, he pulls a great recovery mission, going to hostile hold and scrap looting as much as he can, finding himself a decent playable loadout for now. As you can see, he's always looking for shots with the Mammoth pistol for players that he can key, because he knows that he still needs a refresh. After hitting a body shot with the Mammoth, he tries to key a person, but unfortunately the fight amounts to nothing and both players are left weak. Desperate, Pixie waits until his zone catches up, trying to catch a player off guard, and he manages to find a fight that he can third party for a refresh. After getting this absolutely insane mat refresh of 3 brick, he decides to keep fighting because he knows that this isn't enough. And with so many players trying to get to zone, he ends up managing to catch one out, getting a cone above him, and finding the elimination. After putting this cone above the person's head, it's really important here that he does the right edit to make sure that he doesn't get hit in return. The bottom right tile here is really important because it allows him to shoot the other player without being seen, and creates a right hand peek out of a tough situation. From here, after getting this mat refresh, he's able to use a shock pad combined with an air vent to get into zone. I don't know if the air vent part was intentional or not, but either way, it got him in a little bit deeper than he needed to. However, going into the first moving zone, he doesn't really have enough mats to make it through to the late endgame, simply because his refresh did not have a lot of mats earlier. So he's forced to find another one, and he third parties fight, getting both refreshes. Now that he has over 1,000 builds, he elevates himself into a good mid-ground position. Before, when he was low on mats, he stayed on low ground, but now that he wants to avoid all that congestion, he layers up in a good spot where he's not going to get focus from height, but also not going to get focus from low, and I think this is a big part of his strategy. Pixie hits an absolute flyby 200 on this kid, which I'm gonna be honest, really unfortunate for that guy, but it's a great play from Pixie to make sure that his mats are still refreshed, even in this mid-endgame position where it didn't look like there were a lot of opportunities for refreshes. However, Pixie ends up dropping to low, partly by accident after that refresh, so once popping heals, he knows that he has to go and elevate himself again. Now, at this point, after elevating himself a couple of layers, he knows that he has probably the most mats in the lobby, so his job now is to make sure that he's safe until the top 5 so that he can get a guaranteed good placement out of this game. To do this, he makes sure that he builds in hard mats and stays close to the front side zone in an elevated position away from most of the lobby. Both Pixie and Yanis, who are both very experienced competitive players, Both are in similar positions at this point in the endgame, because their experience tells them that staying on low ground at this point isn't the play because it's too early to take it. Even from a safe mid-ground position and having a lot of mats still, Pixie is never content with the amount of materials and resources that he has. He finds another refresh on the backside, and while it isn't a big mat refresh, it gives him 2 medkits, which are of course the win condition in reload. Now, Pixie doesn't actually use the medkits for the heal off. He ends up using them in a very interesting way. In this top 5 position now, Pixie still has his medkits, so he gets to the front side of zone. And while most of the players are fighting backside and trying to pop the medkits early, Pixie is perfectly safe up here. Him and the hype player are the only 2 players who are in a good position to win this game at this moment. And while most players would probably save the medkits for a potential heal off, Pixie has the understanding to realize that this game isn't going to a heal off. So he plays his medkits for as long as he can, making sure to secure himself a top 3. And avoiding all the fighting that could happen on low ground in a top 5 situation when players are getting desperate. Luckily, he finds a grappler back in zone, which he's able to use to grapple into zone, and at this point, it's already a top 2 and the other player is cracked. So he drops down, collects the mats, and knowing that the other player is probably low on resources, he tries to finish the fight. The other player does a really good job here of getting in, but Pixie's able to find the final elimination, getting his 1 HP clutch. And watching this back from the other POV, it's easy to see why Pixie won. The other player, who was on height all game, was running extremely low on mats. He only had 6 builds, and while he did have a lot of heals, he didn't have any whites to postpone the inevitable. 0 builds at this point, and while he was able to grab the medal, he was severely outmatched in terms of mats. So he had no choice but to jump in on Pixie, and while it almost works, Pixie maintains his composure. Now, going into his second game, Pixie has landed at Elite Experiments, but this is actually just because he instantly died off spawn landing chiseled cubes. In this game, there were quite a few pros, as this was a lobby in which many of the players had won their first game. Pixie gets himself into a bit of an engagement, but seeing as how the other player is on white HP, Pixie quickly closes in and gets the kill. On this next fight, Pixie attempts to get a lurk play, but seeing as how he's unsuccessful, he decides to push up, swing onto the opponent's wall, and putting in pressure. He makes a very smart right window peek, and this allows him to get the wall for free as well as the cone. He tries to piece the opponent, but he gets away. Now Pixie decides to go on the chase, spraying down the opponent and getting straight onto his wall, taking an aggressive peek. But using the combat SMG, he's able to spray down and get the elimination. From this angle, on this right hand peek, there's not too much that the opponent can do to counter this, besides moving out into a different box. It's hard for him to get any counter damage off from this peek, and this allows Pixie to get in the piece into his box, which causes him to panic. Again, we can see Pixie, while standing on the middle of his cone, likes to use that bottom right 4 tile edit, which allows him to get a good peek in, but this time he didn't really need it, as he's able to shoot the opponent through the stair after abusing the combat SMG. In this next fight, Pixie decides to lurk on Nosif and Finyik, who are both pro players, but seeing Nosif popping a medkit right in front of him, it's really just a free kill, and there's not much that Nosif can do from this situation. He tries to fight Finyik right after, assuming that he's weak, but the fight stalls out and Pixie ends up disengaging. However, right after this, he runs into Splash and decides to W key him. Pushing in, he goes from a left hand and gets hit in return from it, but he's able to jump over using the overdrive effect and get the opponent's tops, which ends up getting him a free elimination. Because Pixie had the overdrive effect, he's able to jump up and over after getting hit for that little bit of chip damage from the opponent, and this is what allowed him to get the tops, as the opponent did not have time to place them. He had no time to react, as the overdrive effect just makes your character model go extremely quick, so there wasn't too much that Splash could do once Pixie had his tops and his walls. A couple of rough rotates later though, Pixie ends up using a lot of his heals and all of his mobility, so he uses natural cover here to block much of his rotate so that he doesn't have to use any more of his Flowberry Fizz. Pixie, just like last game, isn't afraid to try to find a refresh extremely early in the endgame, and this pays out for him as he's able to find this dead body, which gets him shockwaves and minis, which is basically all he needs as he had a lot of mats to begin with. This willingness to put himself at risk for potential refreshes even when he has some resources left is a big component in Pixie's gameplay. Now though, getting shockwaves, he's able to fizz shock into the next zone, and while he does end up staying on a relatively low layer, he makes sure to elevate the second he can, so that he has a good position to shockwave into the next zone. Using this high layer positioning, he's able to stay up as much as he can going into the early endgame, which is something that he does in both of the games that he wins. Unfortunately though, with zone pulling up a hill, Pixie's forced into the bottom, and while he has time now, he won't be able to shockwave once a lot of players box up on top of him. To counter this, he decides to get a little bit aggressive on the other players in their lair to pressure them to go early, so that he has time to look for refreshes and eventually shockwave out the back of his box. And this ends up paying off, as Pixie's able to catch a player rotating in very late and gets a free refresh, as well as a good rotate into the next zone. Even when boxing up late, he still makes sure to prioritize getting onto an extremely high layer, so that he's able to shockwave and just have a lot of visibility over the rest of the lobby. And as you start to take a look around the players in the lobby, you start to notice that nearly all of the pros are in similar positions. Nosif, Pixie, Jew, Fishy, they're all playing high layers in the early endgame, so that they have good visibility and options for their rotates. Perhaps the only exception to this is Kurama, but he ends up going down shortly after because he was on a congested low ground layer. Pixie ends up having to shockwave here, but unfortunately with no one to connect to on a high layer, he's forced to drop a couple of layers and only goes one above low ground. But thankfully, since he's in hards, he's okay for now, and he decides to spot out Kurama, who's building in wood, which is a sign that he's weak on materials. He puts pressure on Kurama, and Kurama ends up dropping, which causes him to go down shortly after. Pixie then continues his rotates, staying on a kind of low to mid ground layer, even though he has a lot of builds. But this is because the zone is pulling down a mountain, so he can't really stay up too high or else he's going to get focused from height. Sure enough, with zone pulling down a mountain, there are 9 players left in this lobby, and 4 of them have dropped down to low, while 4 of them have stayed up. Pixie is directly in the middle, 4 players above him, 4 players below him, and this is showing how good of a mid-ground player Pixie is. Even though he has no way to know this, he is literally in the middle of the lobby, which means he gets to avoid all of the attention from high ground and all of the chaos of low ground. And while the zone is kind of pulling around some very hilly, mountainous areas with a lot of steep cliffs, he decides to play the mid-ground just in case that zone pulls weird. So he manages to find a refresh on someone dropping down from the high ground, and this allows him to keep going. But as zone starts pulling across a cliff, he decides to play a little bit lower, and at this point he's actually the lowest in the lobby, which is his win condition. Now all he has to do here is just stay and make sure that he holds his ground against some of the other players. Ju tries to take it from him, but he's able to catch him in the pull piece and gets the elimination. Now, with his threat to low ground taken care of, he's able to basically stay under the radar for the rest of this endgame, as zone pulls back across his old builds. Pixie pretty much tarps along the entire low ground for the rest of the game, as no one else is there to challenge him, and with all the old builds coming from the pullback, no one can really even see him here, and it's hard to pinpoint his exact location. Skipping forward into a top 3, zone's about to run out, so Pixie starts popping his medkits that he's collected from his refreshes earlier in the endgame. Now the other 2 players who have no heals are forced to fight him, and he ends up taking home an easy win. To summarize Pixie's playstyle in a nutshell, he really likes to play mid-ground layers in the early endgame so that he can avoid the high ground and low ground chaos and congestion. Then, later in the endgame, he moves to take his win condition, or plays medkits back in zone if he needs to, so that he can secure himself a top 3 and fight the last player to win. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.